I accidentally transferred $700 to a stranger. He said, "Don't worry about it," and returned $300 more than I sent with a wish of good luck. But a year later, the bank wrote, "Ma'am, $44 million has been deposited into your account." The sender. That same stranger. Good day, dear listeners. It's Anna again. I'm glad you're here with me. Please subscribe to my channel and like this video. And also let me know in the comments which city you're listening from. That way I can see how far my story has traveled. I never thought of myself as a careless person. My name is Amanda Cole. I was 34 years old, and for 6 years I had worked as a senior bookkeeper at Whitmore & Associates, a mid-sized accounting firm in Columbus, Ohio. I raised my son Ethan alone after my divorce, and my days followed a predictable rhythm. Drop him at school, drive to the office on 3rd Street, spend 8 hours reconciling ledgers for other people's money, pick him up, cook dinner, sleep, repeat. It wasn't an exciting life, but it was mine, and it was stable, and stability was something I had fought hard to build. At the firm, I answered to Karen Mitchell, one of the 2 managing partners. Karen was sharp, polished, always the best-dressed person in any room, and she had a way of making you feel grateful just to be spoken to. I respected her. I also, if I'm honest, feared her a little. She had a habit of remembering exactly who had made which mistake and exactly when. The incident that changed everything happened on a Tuesday evening in March. Nothing special about the date except that it was raining and I was tired. I was transferring rent money to my landlord through my banking app, half watching a rerun of some sitcom when I typed the account number from memory instead of checking it. $700 went out. Not to my landlord, to a stranger. I stared at the confirmation screen for a long moment before the sick drop in my stomach caught up with my brain. $700 was not money I could shrug off. It was almost a third of what I had left after rent that month. I immediately messaged the number attached to the transfer, apologizing, explaining, begging. The reply came faster than I expected. "Don't worry about it," it said. "These things happen." I remember reading that twice because it seemed too calm, too easy. I expected anger or silence, or at best a slow, grudging promise to send it back eventually. Instead, 10 minutes later, my phone buzzed again. A transfer notification. Not $700, $1,000. "Consider the extra $300 an apology for making you worry," the message read. "Good luck out there." I sat on my couch with the phone in my hand, and for the first time that night, the fear turned into something else. A small, persistent unease that had nothing to do with the money itself. People didn't do that. Strangers didn't casually return more than they'd received and vanish with a blessing instead of a name. In my line of work, I had seen enough irregular transactions to know that generosity without explanation usually meant one of 2 things. Either the person had more money than sense, or the money wasn't really theirs to give away in the first place. I told myself I was overthinking it. I had a habit of that. Karen once joked that I could find a discrepancy in a jar of loose change. I put my phone down, finished my rent payment correctly this time, and tried to let it go. But small things kept nagging at me over the following weeks. At the office, I noticed Karen and the other partner, Denise Ferris, spending long hours behind closed doors with a set of client files that never crossed my desk. Unusual, since as senior bookkeeper, I normally touched every account eventually. When I asked about the Hargrove Trust reconciliation, a large estate account I'd flagged as overdue, Karen told me, a little too quickly, that she was handling it personally. Denise, usually friendly enough to stop and chat by the coffee machine, started finding reasons to leave the room when I walked in. None of it was proof of anything. I told myself that people get busy, that partners are allowed to handle sensitive accounts themselves, that I was letting one strange text message color everything else. Still, the unease didn't fade. It just went quiet, folding itself into the back of my mind the way a splinter does before it starts to hurt. I didn't know that spring evening that the $700 I'd sent by mistake had been the first thread in something enormous. I didn't know that the stranger who told me good luck out there had chosen my account for a reason. I only knew that something in the ordinary rhythm of my life had shifted, almost imperceptibly, the way a house settles before you notice the crack in the wall. It would be nearly a year before I understood how right I had been to feel afraid. The months after the strange transfer passed in the ordinary blur of work and single motherhood, but I kept a private tally in the back of my mind, the way you keep track of a headache that won't quite go away. Small oddities. The Hargrove Trust file that never returned to general circulation, a new numbered account that appeared in our system under Denise's initials, one I had no access to and, strangely, no reason to have ever been told about. A client, old Mr. Petrakis, who called the office twice asking why his quarterly statement hadn't arrived, and who was told by Karen, in a voice I overheard through her half-open door, that there had been a temporary reporting delay. Reporting delays didn't happen at Whitmore and Associates. We were a firm built on precision. That was the whole point of us. By January, nearly 10 months after the $700 mistake I had almost forgotten, I sat at my kitchen table one night after Ethan had gone to bed, staring at a legal pad where I'd started writing dates. March, the transfer, the stranger, the extra $300. April, the Hargrove file disappears from rotation. June, the unfamiliar account number. September, Mr. Petrakis's missing statement. November, Denise abruptly canceling our annual client file audit, the one we did every year without exception, claiming she'd already handled it. I am not a brave person by nature. I like quiet rooms and predictable outcomes. But I had spent 6 years building a career on the belief that numbers don't lie, even when people do. And what I was looking at on that legal pad was a pattern that no amount of wishful thinking could explain away as coincidence. The fear came first, sharp and immediate. If something was wrong, if money was moving in ways it shouldn't, then I wasn't just an employee who might lose her job over asking the wrong question. I was a bookkeeper. My name was on documentation. If Karen and Denise were doing something illegal and it ever came to light, anyone connected to those files could be dragged into scrutiny, myself included, whether I'd known anything or not. What would you do, I asked myself, sitting there in the quiet of my kitchen, if the ground you stood on for 6 years turned out to be hollow? I thought about Ethan asleep down the hall, about the mortgage I was still 2 years from paying down, about the reputation I had built one careful reconciliation at a time. Staying silent felt safer. Staying silent also felt increasingly like complicity. I decided I would not accuse anyone of anything. Not yet. I would simply do what I did best. Follow the numbers, quietly, carefully, and see where they led. The first step was small and almost embarrassingly simple. I began saving copies. Not stealing, not smuggling out confidential files, just keeping personal notes of dates, file names, and discrepancies I encountered in the normal course of my work, the kind of documentation any careful employee might keep. I bought a cheap notebook instead of using anything on the Office network, something Karen or Denise couldn't access if they ever grew suspicious and searched my computer. I also began paying closer attention to the mysterious stranger from the year before. On a whim one evening, I searched my old messages and found the number still saved in my phone. I didn't message him. Not yet, but something told me, some instinct I couldn't fully justify, that the $700 and the extra $300 hadn't been random generosity at all. It had been a test, or a signal, or a thread left dangling for someone to pull. I didn't know who he was. I didn't know if he was connected to Karen and Denise or to something else entirely. But I found myself circling back to that exchange again and again, the way you return to a locked door you can't quite walk past. By the end of January, my legal pad had grown into a small folder. Dates, discrepancies, the strange account under Denise's initials, the missing statement, the canceled audit. It wasn't proof of a crime. It was, at best, a list of questions. But it was a start. And for the first time since that rainy Tuesday in March, I felt something other than unease. I felt purpose. I decided that on Monday I would request access to the firm's external audit records, official, documented, entirely within my rights as senior bookkeeper. If there was nothing wrong, the request would cost me nothing but a little embarrassment. If there was something wrong, it would be the first real step toward finding out what. I had no idea, that Sunday night, just how quickly the ground beneath me was about to shift, or how close I already was to the truth neither Karen nor Denise wanted anyone, least of all me, to uncover. On Monday morning, I submitted a formal request to Whitmore and Associates compliance officer, a quiet man named Roger Delaney, who worked mostly out of sight, handling regulatory filings and the occasional external audit liaison. My request was simple and, on paper, entirely routine. Access to the external audit trail for accounts flagged with unusual activity in the past 12 months. Standard procedure for a senior bookkeeper conducting internal reconciliation. I framed it exactly that way, because it was true, and because I needed it to look ordinary. Roger approved it within the day, mildly surprised I'd bothered with formal paperwork instead of just pulling the files myself, as I often did. I didn't explain that I wanted a paper trail this time, evidence that I had gone through proper channels in case anyone ever asked why I'd been looking. It took less than a week for Karen to notice. She found me at my desk on Thursday afternoon, her voice pleasant, her eyes not. "I heard you requested an audit pull," she said. "Anything I should know about?" "Just tightening up my year-end reconciliation," I told her, keeping my voice as flat and boring as I could make it. "Standard cleanup." She smiled, the kind of smile that didn't reach anywhere near her eyes, and told me to let her know if I needed help. I said I would. Neither of us believed the other. That evening, Denise stopped by my desk too, ostensibly to ask about an unrelated client file, but her eyes drifted more than once to my monitor, to the folder name still open on my screen. I closed them before she could read the titles. I told myself I was being paranoid. I no longer entirely believed that either. The following Tuesday, the audit records came through Roger's office, delivered as a set of encrypted files I could open only on the compliance terminal, a machine kept separate from the main office network for exactly this reason: protecting sensitive data from casual access. I sat in the small back room after most of the staff had gone home, scrolling through account histories I had never been permitted to see in full. And there it was, the Hargrove Trust. The account Karen had claimed to be handling personally showed a series of transfers over the previous year. Money moved out to 3 different intermediary accounts before being consolidated into a single holding account under a shell company name I didn't recognize, Ashgrove Holdings, LLC. The same shell company appeared again, threaded through Mr. Petrakis' account, and 2 others I didn't recognize at all. small amounts each time, carefully below the threshold that would automatically trigger a compliance flag, skimmed, patiently, over months. My hands were not quite steady as I traced the final line of transfers. Ashgrove Holdings, LLC's registered banking contact was Denise Ferris. Its secondary signatory was Karen Mitchell. I sat back in my chair, the hum of the compliance terminal the only sound in the empty office, and felt the floor of my careful, ordinary life tilt sideways. This wasn't a clerical error. This wasn't a delay in reporting. This was theft, patient and deliberate, built brick by brick out of client trust funds, hidden inside a firm that prided itself on precision. And then, scrolling further, I found the thread that connected everything back to me. 11 months earlier, the same week as my strange late-night transfer, a large sum, $44 million, had briefly passed through a federal seizure and asset recovery process connected to an unrelated fraud case, one the FBI had been quietly investigating for over a year. Buried in a footnote of the compliance file was a name I recognized instantly. Mine. My personal checking account had been flagged months ago in a suspicious activity report, not because I had done anything wrong, but because of a single, small, $700 transaction that had passed briefly through an account under investigation before landing by what I had assumed was accident in mine. He wasn't a stranger who made a mistake, I thought, my pulse loud in my ears. He was testing whether my account was clean. I didn't yet understand the full shape of it, how the money, how Ashgrove Holdings, how the man who'd told me good luck out there connected to Karen and Denise's quiet theft. But I understood, sitting alone in that back room with the compliance terminal's glow, the only light that I had crossed a line I couldn't walk back from. I had proof, real, documented proof. And somewhere in the building, I was certain, Karen and Denise already suspected I'd found it. I didn't sleep that night. By morning, I had made a decision I couldn't unmake. I copied the relevant records using only the legitimate export function Rogers' compliance system allowed for personal audit notes, careful not to touch anything beyond what I was authorized to review. Then I did the one thing that turned suspicion into action. I called the FBI's public fraud tip line and asked cautiously how a private citizen would go about reporting suspected embezzlement connected to a federal investigation she believed she'd been unintentionally drawn into. Within 2 days, I was sitting across from a soft-spoken federal agent named Priya Anand in a beige conference room that smelled faintly of old coffee, walking her through my legal pad, my dates, my discrepancies, and finally, the audit files. She listened without much visible reaction, which somehow unsettled me more than anger would have. When I mentioned the $700 transfer and the mysterious extra $300, her expression shifted, just slightly. "That account," she said carefully, "has come up before. We can't discuss an active investigation, but I'd encourage you to document everything, change your passwords, and be careful about who at your firm knows you've spoken with us." It was, I would later think, the understatement of my year. Karen confronted me 4 days later, not with subtlety this time. She caught me in the parking garage as I was leaving, Denise a step behind her, both of them wearing the kind of calm that takes real effort to fake. "We know you pulled the Ashgrove files," Karen said, no pretense left in her voice. "We know you've been talking to someone. I'd think very carefully, Amanda, about what happens to a bookkeeper's career when her own name shows up in a federal suspicious activity report." My stomach dropped, but I made myself hold still. "My name's in that report because someone used my account without my knowledge," I said. "I have proof of that, too." Denise stepped closer, her voice low. "Proof doesn't matter if no one believes it's clean. You have a son, Amanda, a mortgage. Do you really want to spend the next 2 years explaining yourself to lawyers instead of raising him?" It wasn't a threat spoken outright, nothing so clumsy as that. It was worse. A quiet, precise reminder of exactly what I stood to lose, delivered by 2 women who had spent a year proving they knew how to make inconvenient people disappear from ledgers. I felt real fear then, cold and immediate, the kind that makes your hands shake even when your voice doesn't. "I've already given my statement," I said, which was mostly true and entirely enough. "It's not mine to take back now." Karen's jaw tightened. For one long moment, I thought she might say something she couldn't unsay in a parking garage with security cameras overhead. Instead, she stepped back, smoothing her blazer, the mask sliding back into place. "Then I hope, for your sake, you know exactly what you're doing," she said, and walked away with Denise close behind her. I sat in my car for nearly 20 minutes before I trusted myself to drive. That week, I told Roger I needed to use some accumulated leave. I picked Ethan up early from school on Friday, and we drove 2 hours to my sister's cabin near Hocking Hills, where the cell signal was thin, and the only sounds at night were wind through the trees and my son's laughter as we roasted marshmallows over a fire pit. I didn't check my email. I didn't think about Ashgrove Holdings or federal suspicious activity reports or the particular coldness in Karen Mitchell's eyes. I let myself, for 4 days, simply be a mother and nothing else. It wasn't avoidance, not exactly. It was the kind of deliberate rest I had learned over years of careful budgeting and careful living that a person needs before the harder part of any fight. Agent Anand had told me the investigation would take time, that nothing dramatic would happen overnight, that my job now was mostly to wait, document, and stay safe. Staying safe, I decided, meant giving myself these 4 days before whatever came next. By Sunday evening, driving home with Ethan asleep in the back seat, I felt something settle in me that hadn't been there before. Not confidence exactly, but a kind of steadiness. Karen and Denise had shown me in that parking garage precisely how frightened they were of what I knew. Frightened people made mistakes, and I intended to be ready when they made theirs. The temptation, when it came, was subtler than the threat had been. 10 days after the confrontation in the parking garage, an envelope arrived at my house, not the office, my actual home address, which told me they'd taken the trouble to look it up rather than simply hand it to me at work. Inside was a cashier's check for $25,000, made out to me, with no note attached except a single line of text on a plain card. "For your discretion, no hard feelings." I recognized Karen's handwriting immediately. I had seen it on 100 internal memos. I sat at my kitchen table with the check in front of me for a long time. $25,000 would have paid off my car, covered a year of Ethan's orthodontic work, given us breathing room I hadn't had in years. I would be lying if I said the thought didn't cross my mind, however briefly, however much shame followed it. I had spent my whole career doing precise, unglamorous work for a modest salary, and here was an offer to make a large chunk of my worry simply disappear. But precision was exactly the problem. I understood better than almost anyone at that firm what accepting that check would mean on paper: an unexplained deposit timed suspiciously close to a federal investigation from 2 people already under suspicion of financial misconduct. It wasn't hush money disguised as generosity. It was a trap, dressed up as one. I photographed the check and the card, front and back, without depositing or endorsing either, and called Agent Anand the same afternoon. She told me, in her careful, even voice, that I'd made exactly the right call and asked me to mail the original to her office as evidence rather than keep it in my home. I did not respond to Karen. I didn't need to. My silence this time was the answer. Over the following 2 weeks, I noticed a change in how Karen and Denise treated me at the office. Not hostile exactly, but watchful. The way you watch a fire you're no longer sure you can control. They stopped assigning me new client files. Denise began routing routine questions to a junior associate instead of me. I understood what it was. They were pulling back, trying to isolate whatever I knew and whatever I might still find, without giving me an obvious reason to complain to HR. I let them watch. I did my work carefully, competently, without a hint of the fear that sometimes still crept up on me at 2 a.m. What steadied me most in those strange, suspended weeks wasn't professional composure. It was the people I let back into the parts of my life I had, without quite realizing it, closed off during the months of quiet suspicion and note-taking. My sister Grace, who had listened to the whole story over the phone one night without once telling me I was overreacting, and who simply said, "You did the right thing. Whatever happens next, you did the right thing." My old college friend Rosalind, a family law attorney now, who agreed to review everything I'd sent the FBI and confirmed, gently but firmly, that I had protected myself well. Even Roger, the quiet compliance officer, who found a reason to stop by my desk one afternoon and said only, "For what it's worth, I always thought those Ashgrove numbers looked strange too." I began to understand something I hadn't fully grasped before, that the isolation Karen and Denise had spent a year cultivating, the closed office doors, the redirected client files, the careful control of who knew what, wasn't just about hiding a crime. It was a strategy, whether conscious or not, for making sure no one who noticed something wrong would feel confident enough to say so out loud. I had almost let it work on me, too, in those early months of doubting my own instincts. Not anymore. What would you have done? I sometimes asked myself in the quiet after Ethan went to bed. If $25,000 appeared on your table with your silence as the only price. I didn't have a tidy answer for anyone else. I only knew my own answer, and it had surprised me with how little I'd had to think about it. By the end of that month, I felt something I hadn't expected to feel again so soon after the fear in that parking garage. Steadiness. Karen and Denise were watching me, waiting to see what I'd do next. I intended to give them very little to see, right up until the moment it would matter most. The invitation came from Karen herself, delivered in person at my desk with a warmth so carefully constructed it almost worked. "I think we've let things get tense between us," she said, leaning against the edge of my cubicle wall as if this were any ordinary Tuesday conversation. "And I hate that. I really do, Amanda. We've worked together for 6 years. Would you come by my house Saturday? Just the 3 of us, off the clock. I'd like to clear the air. Woman to woman, no lawyers, no files, just a conversation." I told Agent Anand about the invitation that same afternoon, sitting in my car in the parking garage where, weeks earlier, Karen and Denise had first shown me their teeth. Anand didn't tell me not to go. She couldn't. It wasn't her place, and I was an adult free to make my own choices. But she reminded me, evenly and without drama, that nothing said in a private conversation would carry the legal weight of what I'd already documented and signed, and that I should be careful about what I agreed to, what I signed, and what I said out loud in a house with no recording running. I decided to go anyway. Some part of me wanted, after everything, to look them both in the eye one more time and not flinch. I think I also wanted to know, once and for all, whether there was any version of an explanation that could make sense of what I'd found. Karen's house was exactly as tasteful as I'd expected from years of overhearing her describe renovations at the coffee machine. Soft recessed lighting, expensive but deliberately understated furniture, a bottle of wine already open and breathing on the kitchen island as though this really were nothing more than a friendly evening among colleagues. Denise was there when I arrived, curled into an armchair with a glass already half empty in her hand, her smile warm in a way that didn't match the watchfulness in her eyes, which tracked me across the room the moment I stepped through the door. "We've been unfair to you," Karen said, once we were all seated in her open-plan living room, her voice pitched low and reasonable, almost maternal. "You found something you weren't supposed to find, and instead of talking to us like a colleague, like family, honestly, because that's what this firm has always felt like to me, you went straight to strangers. Federal strangers, Amanda. We understand why you were scared. Anyone would be. But Amanda, we built this firm together, brick by brick, year after year. Doesn't that count for something? Doesn't loyalty mean anything to you?" It was, I realized as she spoke, a performance aimed less at persuading me of their innocence and more at persuading me that loyalty to them should outweigh whatever I believed I knew to be true. Denise picked up the thread smoothly, setting her wineglass down with practiced ease. "There are things about the Ashgrove account you simply don't have context for," she said, folding her hands in her lap like a teacher explaining something patiently to a slow student. "Complicated tax structuring, layered ownership, nothing illegal, just not something we could ever explain to a bookkeeper without opening up serious client confidentiality issues. If you'd just come to us first, Amanda, instead of running straight to the FBI, we could have walked you through all of it. We could have shown you the whole picture." I let the silence sit for a moment before I answered, feeling the weight of both their stares in the too quiet room. "Then show me now," I said. "Walk me through the transfers. Explain the shell company registered under your names that skims below the reporting threshold every single time, month after month, for 2 years. Explain why Mr. Petrakis stopped receiving statements the exact same month his balance dropped by thousands of dollars." The warmth in the room thinned instantly, like a light switched off somewhere behind Karen's eyes. Her smile didn't waver outwardly, but something behind it went hard and calculating, sharpening into someone I barely recognized from 6 years of office pleasantries. "You're making a serious mistake," she said, quieter now, all pretense of reconciliation gone completely. "Whatever you think you've built with the FBI, it's not enough without us confirming any of it in court. And once this becomes public, Amanda, once reporters start digging, your name is sitting in that suspicious activity report right alongside ours. You think a jury sees a meaningful difference between a woman who reported fraud and a woman who quietly benefited from it first?" Denise set down her glass with a sharp click against the side table, the sound loud in the sudden tension. "You could still walk away from this clean tonight," she said, leaning forward. "We tear up whatever agreement you think you've made with them. We forget this whole conversation ever happened. None of us ever mention Ashgrove again, and your life goes right back to normal." I thought in that moment of the notebook I'd started nearly a year earlier at my kitchen table, of every careful entry, every date, of Agent Annan's steady voice telling me I'd done the right thing, of Grace on the phone at midnight, of Rosalind's careful legal reassurance, of Roger's quiet admission that the numbers had always looked strange to him too, even before I'd said a word. I thought of the $25,000 check I hadn't cashed, still photographed and mailed away as evidence, and what accepting either offer in this softly lit kitchen would have cost me in every version of myself I still wanted to be able to look at in a mirror each morning. "I already told them everything," I said, standing slowly, my legs steadier than I expected. "There's nothing left to tear up." Karen's composure finally cracked wide open. "You have no idea what you're about to lose," she snapped, all warmth gone, her voice rising sharply for the first time since I'd known her. Denise didn't bother hiding her fury either, rising from the armchair so abruptly the wine in her glass sloshed over the rim and darkened the pale carpet beneath her feet. I didn't answer either of them. I picked up my coat from the back of the chair and let myself out through the front door, my hands trembling only once I reached my car, safely alone in the dark of Karen's driveway, the porch light behind me finally switching off. The fear was real. I wouldn't pretend otherwise, not to myself and not to anyone who ever asked me about that night afterward, but underneath it, driving home through empty streets with the radio off and my heart still pounding against my ribs, I felt something else too, a hard, clean certainty that I had made the only choice I could live with. Whatever came next, I was no longer the woman quietly doubting her own instincts at a kitchen table a year earlier. I was ready. The call from Agent Anand came on a Wednesday morning in April, 13 months after the night I'd accidentally sent $700 to a stranger. "We're moving forward," she said, her voice carrying a controlled energy I hadn't heard from her before. "We'd like you at the office when it happens, if you're willing. Not required, Amanda. You've already given us more than enough. But given everything you've documented over the past year, your presence would help close out a few remaining questions cleanly, and frankly, I think you've earned the right to see this through." I said yes before I'd fully thought it through, my hand tightening around the phone. The morning of the arrests, Whitmore and Associates looked exactly as it always did. Fluorescent lights humming overhead, junior associates hunched over their monitors sipping bad coffee, the particular hush of an accounting firm on an ordinary Wednesday that had no idea it was about to stop being ordinary forever. I sat at my desk pretending to reconcile a routine file, watching the clock on my monitor, my pulse steady in a way that genuinely surprised me. I had expected to feel afraid, the way I had in Karen's driveway, the way I had reading that first strange text message a year earlier. Instead, I felt strangely calm, the way I imagine you feel once you've already survived the worst version of a thing in your imagination so many times, on so many sleepless nights, that the real version arrives almost gently by comparison. Agent Anand and 2 colleagues arrived just after 10 o'clock, along with a compliance officer from the state accounting board, and unexpectedly, a man I recognized instantly despite never having seen his face before. The same measured, unhurried presence I associated with a single text message a year earlier. "Don't worry about it, these things happen." He introduced himself briefly to Roger as part of the Federal Asset Recovery Team, and I watched Roger's eyebrows lift in quiet surprise. It turned out that the account which had accidentally sent me $700, then returned $1,000, had been part of a controlled operation testing which private accounts connected to the firm's network were clean enough to route recovered funds through safely, one small piece of a much larger federal effort. The $44 million, recovered from an entirely separate fraud case the FBI had already been investigating for years, had ultimately, briefly, and mistakenly been deposited into my account due to a clerical routing error on the government's own side, immediately flagged and reversed within days, long before I ever saw a cent of it beyond that first small, strange transaction. It hadn't been a gift or a scheme aimed at me personally. It had been a test I'd unknowingly passed, one thread among many the investigation had been quietly pulling for over a year, and it had simply, by an accident of banking geography, tangled itself with mine. Karen was called into the main conference room first, ostensibly for a routine compliance review, the same kind of language she herself had once used to explain away the Hargrove Trust. I watched through the glass wall as Agent Annan laid documents across the table one by one. The Ashgrove Holdings filings, the Hargrove Trust transfers, the pattern of skimmed amounts stretching back nearly 2 years, each one methodically placed like a card in a losing hand. Karen's face, so carefully composed in every version of her I had ever known across 6 years of working beneath her, went through a rapid, unglamorous series of expressions: disbelief, then rapid calculation, and finally something closer to panic as she realized, in real time, how completely the paper trail I had helped assemble closed every door she might have used to explain her way out. Denise, brought in minutes later, was worse to watch. She raised her voice almost immediately, gesturing sharply at the files spread across the table, insisting there had to be some misunderstanding, that Karen had handled the technical structuring and she'd simply signed what she was told to sign, again and again. Trust me. Please. I watched Karen's expression flicker toward her former partner with something like betrayal, and understood, watching it happen through that glass wall, that whatever loyalty had once bound the two of them together, the loyalty Karen had invoked so earnestly in her own kitchen just days before, had been exactly as fragile and hollow as everything else they'd built on stolen money. Roger found me afterward, standing near my desk with a stunned, slightly gray look on his face, his hands not quite steady around a mug of coffee he'd forgotten to drink. "I should have said something sooner," he admitted quietly, not quite meeting my eyes. "I saw pieces of it over the years. I just didn't want to believe they added up to what they added up to. I told myself I was imagining things." "Most people don't want to believe it," I told him, and I meant it without bitterness, remembering my own year of quiet doubt at the kitchen table. I understand, better than most, exactly how easy it is to talk yourself out of trusting your own instincts when the people asking you to doubt them hold your paycheck in their hands. By early afternoon, both partners had been formally taken into custody, led out through the same lobby I'd walked through 5 days a week for 6 years, past the same reception desk, under the same fluorescent lights I'd complained about 100 times. Karen didn't look at me as she passed, her chin lifted in a last futile attempt at dignity. Denise did, once, her eyes carrying none of the fury from Karen's kitchen a week earlier, only a kind of hollow, exhausted disbelief that the numbers, in the end, hadn't lied for her the way she'd needed them to for so long. I stood in the quiet aftermath of the emptied office, surrounded by stunned colleagues and the low murmur of speculation already spreading through the building like static, and felt for the first time in over a year something settle completely still inside me. Not triumph exactly. Just the deep, quiet certainty of a woman who had followed the numbers all the way to the truth, and hadn't flinched when the truth turned out to be exactly as ugly as she'd feared it would be. The months that followed the arrests unfolded with the particular, unglamorous slowness of the American legal system, but they unfolded, crucially, in only one direction. Karen Mitchell and Denise Ferris were charged jointly with wire fraud, embezzlement, and money laundering. The federal case built substantially on the very documentation I had assembled at my kitchen table, first on a legal pad and later in a small folder, Documentation that Agent Anand's team eventually expanded into a case spanning nearly 3 years of quietly siphoned client trust funds across a dozen different accounts. Denise, facing the weaker position and the far clearer paper trail, tying her signature directly to Ashgrove Holdings, accepted a plea deal within 4 months, cooperating fully with prosecutors in exchange for a reduced sentence. Her cooperation, ironically, sealed Karen's fate more completely than my documentation alone might ever have managed on its own. Denise testified in a closed deposition Agent Anand later summarized for me in broad strokes over coffee that the scheme had been Karen's idea from the very start, that Karen had approached her nearly 3 years earlier with the entire structure already worked out in careful detail, promising it would never be noticed if they stayed patient and kept every individual transfer small enough to avoid tripping an automatic compliance flag. Karen refused to plead. She fought the case for nearly a year, hiring an expensive, aggressive defense attorney who tried, at trial, to paint the entire scheme as Denise's initiative, and to paint me, in turn, as an overzealous, perhaps even vindictive employee who had misread ordinary tax structuring as fraud out of some personal grudge. It didn't work. The jury, presented with 2 years of meticulous transfer records, the shell company's registration documents bearing her own signature, Mr. Petrakis's missing statements laid out chronologically, and Denise's own detailed testimony against her, took less than 6 hours to convict her on every single count. Karen Mitchell was sentenced to 11 years in federal prison, along with a restitution order requiring repayment of the full embezzled amount, a sum the court's own forensic accounting placed just over $3 million once every skim transfer across every affected client account was fully traced and totaled. That figure was far smaller than the $44 million that had briefly and mistakenly passed through my own account by accident, but it was devastating enough on its own to most of the modest, trusting clients whose retirement funds and family trusts had quietly bled money, month after month, for years without their knowledge. Denise received 4 years, largely on the strength of her cooperation with prosecutors, along with her own separate restitution obligations and a lifetime ban from practicing accounting or holding any fiduciary license anywhere in the state of Ohio. Both women lost, permanently and irreversibly, the professional identities they had each spent decades carefully constructing. Whitmore and Associates did not survive as an entity in the end. The remaining partners voted to dissolve the firm within the year, unable to retain clients once the scandal became public and local news outlets picked up the story, and most of us scattered to other firms across the city, carrying the weight of the firm's collapse with us in different ways. I received, eventually, a modest whistleblower compensation from the federal government, calculated as a percentage of the total recovered restitution. Not the kind of sum that changes a life overnight, certainly nothing like the $44 million that had once briefly and mistakenly touched my account, but enough, combined with careful saving and 2 years of discipline, to finally pay off my car outright and put a real, meaningful dent in Ethan's college fund. Mr. Petrakis, when I ran into him months later at a grocery store on the east side of town, recognized me immediately across the produce aisle and gripped my hand with both of his eyes visibly wet, thanking me for something I hadn't fully realized until that very moment had mattered so deeply to someone who wasn't me. "I thought I was losing my mind," he told me, his voice unsteady, wondering where my money kept going every quarter, wondering if I'd simply forgotten how much I had. You gave me my peace of mind back, Amanda, even if you didn't know it at the time, even if you never met me before all this. I thought often, in the quiet aftermath of those months, about the man behind the original text message, the government asset recovery contact who had unknowingly set the whole chain of scrutiny in motion by testing my account and briefly, mistakenly, routing $44 million through it, due to nothing more than a clerical error. I never learned his real name, and I stopped expecting to. Agent Annan told me only that his role in the operation had concluded successfully, and that I should consider the coincidence closed for good. In a strange way, I found myself grateful to him regardless, not for the money itself, which I had never actually kept or spent a cent of, but for the accident that had first sharpened my instincts enough to notice everything that came crashing in after it. Karen and Denise, once the two most composed, most controlled people I had ever worked for across 6 years of quiet, careful bookkeeping, were gone from my daily life entirely. One behind bars in West Virginia, one stripped permanently of the profession that had defined her entire adult identity, both facing years of repayment for a scheme that had, in the end, unraveled completely because one careful bookkeeper had simply refused to stop asking where the numbers led. There had been no compromise in how it ended, no quiet settlement, no negotiated silence. There had only been the truth, laid out in full documented detail exactly as I had promised myself, that Sunday night at my kitchen table with a cheap notebook and a growing list of dates, that it eventually would be. 2 years after the trial, my life looked almost unrecognizable from the anxious, careful existence I'd led before that rainy Tuesday in March, when I'd sent $700 to the wrong account. I had taken a position at a smaller employee-owned accounting cooperative across town, one that specialized, somewhat pointedly, in transparent nonprofit and small estate work, the kind of clients most vulnerable to exactly the sort of quiet theft I'd uncovered at Whitmore and Associates. My new colleagues knew my history before I ever mentioned it. Word travels fast in a profession built on trust, and more than one of them told me, in the first weeks, that my old case had been discussed in continuing education seminars as a cautionary tale about internal fraud detection. Ethan turned 12 that spring, tall and increasingly opinionated, thriving in a way that made the hardest year of my life feel, in retrospect, like a price I'd have paid gladly all over again. We moved into a slightly larger house that fall, nothing extravagant but a home with a real backyard and a kitchen big enough for both of us to cook in without bumping elbows, paid for with a combination of savings, a modest raise, and the whistleblower compensation I'd finally stopped feeling strange about accepting. I found, too, that the steadiness I'd discovered in myself during those frightening months hadn't faded once the crisis ended. If anything, it had settled into something closer to confidence. I spoke, occasionally, at local financial literacy workshops for small business owners and elderly clients, teaching them the same kinds of small red flags I'd once trained myself to notice. The missing statement, the account that never rotates through routine review, the manager who insists on handling something personally. Rosalind, my attorney friend, once joked that I'd accidentally become a minor local expert on fraud detection. I told her I'd have preferred to learn it a less terrifying way, but I wouldn't trade the certainty it had given me for anything. Karen Mitchell, meanwhile, was serving her sentence at a federal facility in West Virginia. Through channels I didn't seek out but occasionally heard through old industry contacts, I learned that her restitution obligations had consumed nearly everything she'd once owned. The tasteful house where she'd offered me wine and manipulation in the same breath had gone to a court-ordered sale within the first year. the proceeds absorbed into the repayment fund for her former clients. Her professional license was permanently revoked. Even after release, she would never again be permitted to touch another person's finances. I heard secondhand that her only son had stopped visiting after the second year, unable to reconcile the mother he remembered with the woman the trial had revealed. Denise fared little better, despite her cooperation and shorter sentence. Released after 3 years with credit for good behavior, she found herself unable to secure work anywhere near her old field. A permanent state license ban followed her name into every background check any reputable firm ever ran. The last I heard, she was working retail in a strip mall outside Dayton, a life so distant from the confident, polished woman who'd once sat across from clients discussing 6-figure trust accounts that I found it difficult, even now, to feel much satisfaction in it. Mostly, I just felt the particular emptiness that comes from watching someone waste what could have been an entirely different, entirely honest life. I didn't spend much time thinking about either of them, in the end, not out of forced forgiveness and not out of lingering anger, but simply because my own life had grown full enough that there wasn't much room left over for people who had tried so hard to make me doubt myself. I thought, more often, about Mr. Petrakis and the dozen other clients who'd quietly gotten their retirement funds restored. I thought about the young associates at my new firm who sometimes asked me, half joking, half serious, how I'd known to keep looking when everyone around me insisted there was nothing to see. You just have to trust the numbers, I told them, even when trusting them costs you something. It had cost me a year of quiet fear, a friendship I'd once had with people I'd trusted, and more sleepless nights than I could easily count. But it had given me back something far more valuable in return, the simple, hard-won certainty that I could trust my own judgment, even when the people with the most power over my life were doing everything they could to convince me otherwise. Looking back now, I think about how close I came to talking myself out of that first uneasy feeling, how easy it would have been to accept the silence, the money, the comfortable explanation. But the truth doesn't stay buried just because it's inconvenient, and neither should we. If you were in my position, a strange text message, an unexplained fortune, 2 powerful people asking you to look away, what would you have done? Would you have stayed quiet? Or would you have followed the numbers all the way to the truth, whatever it cost you? If this story meant something to you, subscribe, leave a comment below, and let me know. Thank you for listening.